In 2001, one of the most iconic American companies in history quietly changed its name. No press conference, no celebration, no explanation to the millions of customers who had trusted that name for nearly 150 years. The company just disappeared, replaced overnight by a corporate alias so generic it could have been a parking lot management firm. The name they buried? Smith & Wesson. The name they replaced it with? American Outdoor Brands. And here's what makes it truly shocking. They didn't change it because the business was failing. They didn't change it because of a bankruptcy or a merger. They changed it because the company had made a deal with the Clinton administration that so enraged their own customers, their own people, that dealers stopped stocking their products, police departments canceled contracts, and employees quit in protest. Smith & Wesson didn't just change its name, it ran from it. And the story of why, and how the company clawed its way back from the edge of total collapse, is one of the most dramatic and least told stories in American business history. To understand how far Smith & Wesson fell, you first need to understand what they built and how long it took to build it. Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson met in the early 1850s in Norwich, Connecticut. Both were experienced gun makers. Both had been thinking about the same problem. What if you could build a repeating pistol that used self-contained metallic cartridges instead of loose powder and ball? Every other repeating firearm of the era, including Colt's revolvers, still required the shooter to load powder and ball into each chamber individually. It was slow, weather-dependent, and unreliable under pressure. Smith & Wesson believed there was a better way. In 1856, they formed a partnership, secured the patent rights to a bored-through cylinder, a design that allowed a fully self-contained cartridge to pass completely through the cylinder from the rear, and released the Model 1 revolver. It was chambered in .22 rimfire, the first truly practical self-contained metallic cartridge revolver ever made. The timing was almost supernaturally good. 5 years later, the Civil War began. Union soldiers who could afford it bought Smith & Wesson revolvers out of their own pockets as backup sidearms. The Model 1 was small enough to conceal, fast enough to reload under fire, and reliable enough to trust when everything else had gone wrong. By the end of the war, Smith & Wesson had a waiting list that stretched years into the future. That waiting list was the foundation of everything that followed, and what followed was a century of American firearms history that touched nearly every major conflict, every American frontier, and eventually every police holster in the country. For the better part of the 20th century, if you were a police officer in the United States, you carried a Smith & Wesson. That's not an exaggeration, it's demographics. The .38 Special Revolver and later the .357 Magnum were standard issue for departments from New York City to small-town Kansas for decades. The Model 10, introduced in 1899, became the single best-selling revolver in American history. Millions were produced, millions were carried. Smith & Wesson didn't just sell to law enforcement. They helped shape what American law enforcement looked like. When departments needed a more powerful cartridge, Smith & Wesson developed the .357 Magnum in 1935, working directly with FBI agent and firearms expert Philip Sharp. When departments transitioned to semi-automatic pistols in the 1980s, Smith & Wesson developed the third-generation autos to keep pace. The brand wasn't just a supplier, it was a partner, embedded into American policing at an institutional level that took generations to build, which makes what happened in the year 2000 all the more devastating. By the late 1990s, American gun manufacturers were facing a coordinated legal assault. Cities across the country, led by New Orleans, Chicago, and eventually dozens of others, were filing lawsuits against firearms manufacturers, arguing that the companies bore responsibility for gun violence in their cities. The legal theory was novel and contested. The financial threat was real. Most gun manufacturers banded together to fight the lawsuits. Smith & Wesson, then owned by a British company called Tompkins plc, made a different decision. In March 2000, Smith & Wesson signed an agreement with the Clinton administration and several municipal governments. In exchange for having the lawsuits dropped, Smith & Wesson agreed to a sweeping set of conditions, including design changes, mandatory safety devices, limits on dealer sales practices, and internal oversight mechanisms that went far beyond what any law required. The American firearms community reacted with fury. Gun owners saw it as capitulation to political pressure. Dealers saw it as Smith & Wesson voluntarily accepting restrictions that its competitors refused to accept, putting loyal Smith & Wesson stockists at a competitive disadvantage. Law enforcement agencies that had carried Smith & Wesson for decades began switching to Glock and Sig Sauer. The NRA called for a boycott. Gun shops pulled Smith & Wesson products from their shelves, not because they were told to, because their customers stopped asking for them. Within months, Smith & Wesson's sales had collapsed by nearly 40%. The British parent company, Tompkins plc, had bought Smith & Wesson in 1987 for $112 million. In 2001, they sold it for $15 million, an 87% destruction of value in 14 years. The buyer was a small Arizona-based safety equipment company called Safety Hammer Corporation. The oldest and most storied name in American handguns had just been sold for the price of a modest house. The new owners immediately did two things. First, they repudiated the Clinton Agreement, quietly shelving the commitments that had triggered the boycott in the first place. Second, they began the long, painful process of rebuilding trust with the customers and dealers who had walked away. It worked, slowly, then all at once. The American firearms market surged after September 11, 2001. It surged again after the 2008 election, and again after Sandy Hook. Each political moment that raised fears of tighter gun restrictions sent Americans to gun stores in record numbers, and Smith & Wesson, with its factory in Springfield, Massachusetts running full capacity, was there to meet them. By 2016, Smith & Wesson was generating over $900 million in annual revenue. The company that had been sold for $15 million in 2001 was now worth billions. The comeback was one of the most remarkable in American manufacturing history. And then, in 2016, the company did something that stunned the industry again, but for a completely different reason. They changed their name. Not to run away from something this time, to run toward something. The parent company rebranded as American Outdoor Brands Corporation, positioning itself as a diversified outdoor products company rather than a pure firearms manufacturer. Smith & Wesson remained the name on the guns, but the corporate umbrella was deliberately designed to distance the parent entity from the firearms identity. The market shrugged, the customers shrugged, and 4 years later, in 2020, the company split itself in two, spinning off the non-firearms outdoor brands into a separate company and renaming the firearms business back to Smith & Wesson Brands, Inc. A full circle. 15 years of corporate identity gymnastics, and they ended up right back where they started. Here's the thing about Smith & Wesson that all the corporate maneuvering obscures. The name survived everything. The Clinton deal, the boycott, the $15 million fire sale, the rebranding, the split, and the re-rebranding. Because the underlying product never stopped being good. The Model 10 that police carried in 1955 was a great revolver. The M&P line that dominates law enforcement and civilian sales today is a great pistol. The company that Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson built in 1856 on the idea that a self-contained metallic cartridge could change the way a man defended himself. That idea was correct then, and the products built on it are still correct now. The corporate decisions that surrounded those products were sometimes disastrous. The ownership changes, the political capitulation, the identity crisis, the name changes, none of it came from the factory floor. It came from boardrooms populated by people making decisions about a product they didn't fully understand and a customer base they repeatedly underestimated. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same story as Remington, the same story as Marlin. The same story as every American brand that built its reputation on generations of craftsmanship and then handed the keys to people whose primary qualification was reading a balance sheet. The difference with Smith & Wesson is that the product was strong enough and the customer base loyal enough to survive the worst of it. Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson built something in 1856 that could apparently survive even its own management. That's either a testament to the original vision or a very American kind of stubbornness. Probably both. If this story hit you, drop a comment with the first Smith & Wesson you ever owned or shot. I want to hear it. And if you want more stories about the American brands that built this country, survived the people who tried to break them, and kept showing up anyway, subscribe and ring the bell.